I'm delighted to welcome everybody to the Kogut Center tonight. My name is Amanda Anderson. I'm the director of the center, and it's my great pleasure to be co-sponsoring this event along with the library. We've been doing a number of events over the course of the year, but this is the first time we've actually done an event here as opposed to the beautiful digital lab in the library, but this is also a very nice space, I think you'll find. As is clear from the title for tonight's event, this series is meant to examine, discuss, and engage questions having to do with new forms of scholarly publication. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the introducer, a new member of the Brown community, Brian Kroxel, who is the digital humanities librarian. And he's been absolutely instrumental in setting up tonight's very distinguished panel of guests. And so he will give you a little more information about what's to come. So I welcome Brian here.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone, especially our visitors from out of town. We see lots of people who are not members of the Brown community, and we're glad to have you here with us. So our plan for the evening is I'm going to introduce one speaker at a time, and then she'll come up and give her presentation. They'll return to their seats just so they can see one another's slides, and at the conclusion of the prepared remarks, we'll have the panelists take a seat here, and I will moderate, but I'm sure I know the work of all three of these women, and there won't be much of a need for me to interject. You will want to talk to all of them. So I'm going to begin by introducing Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is Associate Executive Director of the Modern Language Association, as well as the Director of Scholarly Communication. She holds as well appointments as Visiting Research Professor of English at NYU, and Visiting Professor of Media at Coventry University. She's the author, most recently, of Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology in the Future of the Academy, which was published by NYU Press in November 2011. It was also released in draft form for open peer review of fall 2009. I remember that moment very well. It was one of the most exciting things that was happening in fall 2009. I had a kid born that year, but that was okay. Kathleen is also the author of The Anxiety of Obsolescence, The American Novel in the Age of Television, which was published in 2006 by Vanderbilt and is, of course, available in print. And she's the co-founder of the digital scholarly network Media Commons. She's published articles and notes in journals, including the Journal of Electronic Publishing, PMLA, Contemporary Literature, and Cinema Journal. So please join me in welcoming Kathleen Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Let me bring the computer back to life. So again, thank you. I'm really glad to have a chance to be here today to talk a little bit about some of the recent efforts of the Modern Language Association to develop and support new models for thinking about scholarly communication in an age that is increasingly defined by open networks. Now, a couple of years ago, Abby Clobridge pointed out in reporting on a public comment meeting that was held at the National Academy of Sciences, it was a meeting that focused on public access to federally funded research, that among the publishers present at that meeting, we were the only one to offer full support for such a model. Now, I hope today to give you a bit of insight into how we at the MLA understand our role in developing and supporting new models for scholarly communication, a few of the primary ways in which we're doing so, and a little bit about why it is that we hold so strongly to the idea that scholarly societies are the ideal location for new models like this to take root. So since the founding of the Royal Society of London, in fact, learned and professional societies have been created precisely in order to help facilitate communication among their members and between those members and the broader intellectual world. Now, early on, that communication took place via meetings and via letters sent amongst the members between meetings. And over time, the meetings gradually developed into regularly scheduled conferences, and the letters were gathered into systematically produced and distributed journals. And those journals accrued a series of formal publishing processes, including editing and peer review, that came to mark them as authoritative resources for developing knowledge in their fields. And those resources came to be valued not only by their original audience, the members of the society, but also by a broader range of scholars, researchers, and students. And as a result, research libraries collected those journals and made them available to our patrons, or to their patrons. This was a system that worked, by and large. Scholars joined societies in order to gain access to the resources and conversations those societies made available, and societies were supported in their work not only by those members, but also by libraries, whose subscriptions extended the reach of their resources. The funds that were generated through membership dues and subscriptions enabled the societies not only to fulfill their mission of facilitating scholarly communication, but also to do other kinds of work on behalf of their members, including advocating for the field within institutions and on the national and international scene, supporting members in developing professional practices and standards, and so on. Joining such a society was what professionals did, and scholarly communication was what scholarly societies were for. Now, things have changed over the last several decades, however, and the development of new technologies for communication is only one of those changes. Scholars' professional lives have become increasingly precarious as employment conditions in colleges and universities have dramatically weakened. And as a result, an increasing number of scholars are unable or unwilling to commit the ongoing resources to professional societies that they feel cannot adequately assist in meeting their core needs. University and research libraries' budgets have been strained by the need to maintain often exorbitant subscriptions to journals sold by commercial publishers. And as a result, those libraries are decreasingly willing and able to help support the not-for-profit societies to which the scholars at their institutions belong. And societies find themselves straining under declining membership levels, increasing publishing costs, and diminishing subscription revenue. And as a result, many societies have turned to commercial publishers as a means of sustaining their communication programs and supporting their other functions. But those publishers, of course, have a very different sense of mission from the scholars, libraries, and societies among which they mediate. So into this already complex set of competing interests and needs enter the internet, and particularly the World Wide Web. The web was, like scholarly societies, invented for the express purpose of supporting communication amongst researchers by allowing them to create pages on which they could share their work with one another and with the world. Now, the difference, of course, is that the web permits any individual scholar with server access and a little bit of technical knowledge to share their work directly and immediately, further diminishing their apparent need for those collectives that scholarly societies have historically provided. As a result of those tensions, recent discussions about the role that open access might play in the future of scholarly communication have been beset by some misunderstandings, some of which I think are intentional and some utterly unintentional. Many scholars fear that open access will result in a chaos of self-publishing without any peer review, for instance, despite the fact that, as we'll hear more about in a little bit, open access is perfectly compatible with peer review, and that new modes of review for openly published work are being developed. Many societies argue that open access is financially unsustainable and that it will destroy the business models on which they have relied, when in fact a range of new models for open access publishing are coming into being. Not to mention, of course, that several commercial publishers have recently launched OA Ventures, which they certainly would not have done if they hadn't found a profit model in it somewhere. Now, on the other hand, many people believe that open access publishing can be done for free. And while it's true that the costs of reproduction for scholarship online trend towards zero, significant costs of production remain. And as a result of these misunderstandings and miscommunications, arguments around open access as a new model for the distribution of scholarship tend to wind up in a stalemate of sorts, with various constituencies involved talking past rather than with one another. Now, we at the MLA strongly believe that this need not be so. We all, scholars, libraries, societies, and the broader public, share the goal of increasing the wealth of knowledge that we hold in common. And if we focus on that collective goal, a viable path forward might be carved out. There is still reason for some benefits of membership in a scholarly society to be exclusive to that society's members. I mean, there is still a value that's provided in the editorial work that's done by a scholarly society in producing authoritative research records. But like scholars in libraries, societies really must begin to grapple with the shifts in value that have been created in and around the internet. And all of the recent changes in the profession that I described earlier, including the casualization of academic labor and the severe constraints on library budgets, require us to contemplate the possibility that the locus of a society's value in the process of knowledge creation may be moving from providing limited access to certain research products to instead facilitating the broadly open distribution of the work that's being done by its members. Now, this is a profound shift, and not just for the societies, but for the members as well. Pardon me. The scholarly society may, in coming years, operate under a model in which, rather than becoming a member in order to receive the society's products, one instead becomes a member in order to get one's own work out to the world, surrounded by and in communication with the other work that's being done by experts in that field. Now, insofar as the reason for being of scholarly societies is and long has been facilitating a range of conversations amongst members in the field, the value of joining a scholarly society in the age of open, public, web-based communication, then, lies in the ability to participate in that conversation. And so for that reason, one of our primary initiatives in the Office of Scholarly Communication has been the development of MLA Commons. MLA Commons is a flexible, dynamic platform on which our members can collaborate with one another, can participate in a wide range of group discussions, and can share their work openly and freely with the world. Now, there are spaces on MLA Commons in which members can engage directly with one another in those internal, field-specific conversations that help drive their work forward. And this is the discussion space for one of the MLA's forums, which are our subfield groups within the organization. All of our forums have discussion spaces like these open to them, and groups for our forums are public, which means that anyone who is interested can visit and read what's going on in them, though only registered members can participate. We also host a range of private groups that support the work of entities like our committees, so where work needs to not be public, it can be made so. Beyond the discussion groups, there are also open spaces in which those scholars can engage not just with one another, but with other interested readers around the questions that concern them, broadening the sense of the scholarly community beyond the in-group. This is the site of our working group on K-16 alliances, who are actively reaching out to primary and secondary school teachers in order to collaborate with them on strengthening the humanities across our educational system. The Commons thus enables the MLA not just to push information out to subscribers, as traditional publications long have done, and not just to host information for those who come seeking it, as websites standardly do, but to facilitate a range of forms of exchange among scholars and between scholars and the surrounding culture. The Commons also enables MLA members to create public professional profiles for themselves and their work through our portfolio system. And these profiles present both a public-facing view of the member as scholar, as well as a Commons-facing view of the member's work within the network. Most importantly, however, last May, we launched the beta version of a crucial new means of enabling our members to get their work into public circulation, CORE, which is a fully integrated disciplinary repository that provides scholars with an open access deposit and storage facility for a wide variety of forms of scholarly output, including preprints, presentations, syllabi, data sets, you name it. Items deposited in CORE are marked up with the appropriate metadata, they're associated with the Creative Commons license of the depositor's choice, and they're assigned a DOI, rendering them permanently addressable. Deposits can also be shared directly through the network with forums, which notify their members that new materials that they may be interested in have been made available. Thus, you may have noticed that Paul Fife's syllabus back here on reading literature in the digital age, I don't know if the slide extends all the way down to where it says Activity 91 down at the bottom, right? So he's gotten 91 downloads as of this morning's screenshot. And all of that was since Thursday evening when he deposited this file. So that's a pretty amazing kind of nexus of distribution. In any event, core deposits are, of course, associated with user profiles. So it works to create this portfolio for the member of the work that he or she has shared through the network. Now, the Commons also provides a platform for the MLA itself, right? Hosting a number of our more formal publications, including our journal Profession and Literary Studies in the Digital Age, which was our first fully publicly accessible evolving anthology. It was originally published in 2013, and it has since added a couple more chapters, and there's now a call out for further work to be added to the anthology. We're also using the Commons as a space within which we can openly develop new publications, including those that, like Teaching Modernist Women's Writing in English, are on the path toward print publication, as well as those that, like Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, are exploring new networked forms and formats. And the Commons is supporting many of our other projects as well, including Connected Academics, which is working to support doctoral candidates and recipients in MLA fields as they seek rewarding careers across a broadening humanities workforce, as well as supporting the work of MLA committees, including the Committee on Contingent Labor in the Profession. Now, all of these sites together are enabling MLA members to participate in a wide range of scholarly and professional conversations and to get their work out into circulation, both among their fellow members and across the broader public sphere. Alongside the platform, however, we really must work with MLA members to develop a set of new professional practices and standards for all of these forms of publicly accessible communication, including new kinds of editorial practices, new modes of peer review, and new modes of professional evaluation. And we're committed to the idea that the key roles for the society in the coming years will be to support these new practices, to help promote the work done by our members, and to help create the broadest possible public understanding of the importance of such work for our collective future. And the importance of creating that public understanding, I think, cannot be overstated. No less than the future viability of higher education itself requires that we collectively reclaim the intellectual growth fostered in the academy as a public good rather than a private responsibility. But that public good cannot be created by simply being stated. It's our responsibility, all of our responsibility, to make the good that is our work public. So I hope that those of you who are in MLA fields will join us and join the Commons and really help support the development of the open, networked future for scholarship that we all seek. Thank you.
So I'm pleased to now introduce Allison Muddett, who has been director of the University of California Press since 2011, where she's focused on reshaping the press's strategy and structure to meet the needs of its diverse audiences in the digital age. Allison has 25 years' experience in scholarly publishing, which began at Blackwell in Oxford, where she rose to become publisher for the Humanities Division. In 1997, she moved to Taylor & Francis in Philadelphia as publishing director of the Behavioral Sciences Division. She joined Sage in 2001 as vice president and editorial director, and was appointed executive vice president in 2004, where she led the Sage's publishing programs across books, journals, and digital during a period of tremendous growth. Allison is a regular speaker at industry meetings and is currently vice chair of the Scientific Publications Committee, a member of the Open Science Committee of the American Heart Association, and member of the board of directors of KN Consultants. She has also served on the Executive Council of the Professional and Scholarly Publishing Division of the American Association of Publishers, and was co-chair of the Dean's Leadership Council at California State University, Channel Islands. On a somewhat personal note, I got to see Allison, as I shared with some people this morning, speak at the most recent MLA on a panel that Kathleen had organized out of the Office of Scholarly Communication, and was tremendously taken with the work that the University of California Press is doing in open access. And so I'm excited to hear more from Allison Muddett. Please join me in welcoming her.
Great, thank you. Well, it's good to be here and talking about the work that I'm very excited about that we're doing at UC Press, and so I'll be interested to talk with all of you afterwards and here. So we have focused at UC Press on open access over the last couple of years, and we've launched both an open access journal program, Collabra, and Luminous, our open access monograph program. And given the focus here today, I'm really going to talk about the monograph program, which we launched about a year ago. We started publishing books in the fall. And I'm going to talk about Luminous itself to tell you a little bit more about the model. But I also want to talk a little bit about the reasons we developed Luminous and what we've learned so far that I think tells us a little bit about the ways in which scholarly communication in the humanities is evolving and in some cases isn't evolving. So the idea that became Luminous started at a workshop that we held, I think about 2 years ago now, in partnership with the UC Humanities Research Institute. We brought together faculty, librarians, and press staff, really to address the core challenge that we were encountering as publishers, and that is that while the nature of scholarship has been undergoing rapid transformation in the digital age, neither the modes of publishing nor the assessment of that scholarship had really kept pace with that. And so what we really wanted to try and address was the ways in which the press could better support new initiatives in humanities scholarship. So before I move into that, I just want to give a brief definition of how I am talking about open access. There are many different definitions of open access out there. And so just to be clear, we're all on the same page. What we're talking about is the free, immediate, online availability of scholarly output. So that really means it's free of access tolls that get you to the scholarship itself. Now, open access, as it's evolved primarily in the journal world, also assumes certain freedoms about the restrictions that exist on the reuse of that content. There's more debate about that in the books world, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in my presentation later. So a little bit first about the monograph. At the center of debates over the future of scholarly communication lies the humble monograph, in which librarians complain they don't get enough usage, and we as presses complain that we don't get enough sales. It always seems that someone else is to blame for the monograph, authors for wanting to write them, publishers for publishing them, and librarians for not buying them. But the crisis of the monograph is anything but recent. From the early 1970s, after the sort of golden age of higher education and hence university presses in the 50s and 60s, we started to see a decline in library purchasing of monographs. And over the past couple of decades, those challenges have really been exacerbated by continuing declines in library budgets, often due to soaring journal prices, as Kathleen touched on, but also due to sort of the increasing consolidation in the scholarly publishing industry, and most recently by the advent of digital technologies. So just to give you an idea, when I started my career at Blackwell in 1988, we were selling about 2,000 to 2,500 copies of the average monographs. Typically today, that's somewhere between 300 and 400 copies. So while new technologies have provided some relief for us as presses in terms of enabling shorter run printing, the impact of the Great Recession of 2008 has been a further downturn in library purchasing of monographs. And although some of the new demand-driven models, patron-driven acquisition, for example, have helped libraries, they've just further exacerbated the problem for presses. And so our goal with Luminous was to address what we saw as the three key shortfalls of the current model. The first is this increasing unsustainability of the financial model for both presses and libraries. And then secondly, the issue of access. We believe as a university press that we have a responsibility to extend access and circulation to as far as possible, ideally to all those who are interested in and would benefit from it, but most definitely beyond the 300 copies the average monograph sells to a wealthy Western library at this point, or perhaps not so wealthy. But then finally, we wanted to think about models that really enabled humanities scholarship to move from this closed model of print into the more dynamic, collaborative digital space that other scholarship has now moved. But as we started to think about this for the monograph, we recognize that while monographs remain an important and distinctive vehicle for scholarly communication in the humanities, we were really interested in developing ways not only to preserve that, but to think about how we could reinvigorate the monograph via more open digital models. But we also believed that the adoption of OA models in these fields really required us to start by fully understanding the concerns that the academic community had about moving to digital OA models, and to ensure that the models we develop didn't do anything to damage the way in which research is produced and shared in these fields. And so in surveying the landscape for open access monograph, we broadly identified 4 challenges. And first and foremost of those, I think, is the dual role that the monograph plays in those fields. It is, on the one hand, a vehicle for sustained thought about a specific scholarly argument that becomes part of the building block of scholarship in those fields. But it's also a marker of academic achievement and prestige for its author, and one that plays a critical role in his or her career. As such, the monograph plays 2 distinct and possibly ill-aligned roles, one for readers and the other for authors. The second challenge was the issue of print. And there are certainly some significant cultural challenges for disciplines that remain heavily invested in the slow forms of knowledge making that are represented by the monograph. One of these is an attachment to print, but there's been some interesting work looking sort of beyond that to the ways in which the materiality of the book impacts the scholarship itself, and where the visual grammar of the page is a key part of the publication that really isn't that well replicated by digital technology at this point. And so for all of these reasons, I think, monograph publishing has remained pretty conservative and largely untouched by the opportunities that network digital media presents. And finally, and I think uniquely for monographs, the complexity is heightened by the fact that we're trying to manage a switch to both digital and open access at the same time. If you think back to journals, journals had moved online primarily in terms of both publication and the ways in which they were read sometime before open access became a significant issue. So as we started to develop our model at UC Press, we spent a lot of time talking to faculty and librarians and administrators across campuses. We also carried out a survey, had about 1,500 responses from faculty across humanities and social sciences in both North America and Europe. And you can see here some of the key concerns that we heard from faculty about moving to these models. Primarily there was a great deal of confusion and misunderstanding about open access, most commonly that open access publications aren't properly peer-reviewed. There was a concern, especially among junior faculty, about whether open digital models would count in the all-important promotion and tenure process. And perhaps not surprisingly, another significant concern was how the models that had been developed would work for the humanities. So the dominant, what has become called the dominant gold model of publication in open access, is based on the author paying a fee to publish. And those are models that have really been developed for large science fields that have significant grant funding that can cover those costs. And of course, they simply don't translate readily to the underfunded humanities and social sciences. So as we developed our model, which you can see sort of the basic business model represented here, we wanted to make sure that we retain what was valuable about the monograph. But it was also critically important for us to ensure that a Luminous monograph is no different to any other monograph that's published by UC Press in terms of the process of selection, of peer review, of editorial development, and editorial development. In terms of the business model, we started from the premise that the challenges of the monograph were not ones that could be solved by presses or libraries alone, and that really what we were dealing with was more of a systemic dysfunction that really required a collaborative approach. So we have developed, what I would loosely call a sort of crowd-funded model at the moment, that draws upon the sources of funding that are available at this point in time, though I would say I fully expect this funding model to evolve as the system evolves over the coming years. So we started by really trying to sort of keep our costs as low as possible. So the baseline cost for a monograph in this program is $15,000, and we have 4 different sources of income that help us cover those costs. The first is a sort of indirect subsidy from UC Press, in that we continue to cover many of the overheads involved. And then the direct costs of publication are covered from 3 other sources: revenue that we receive from print sales, support from libraries, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then there's a title publication fee that comes from the author. Our assumption, of course, is not that the author is paying for this out of his or her pocket, but that it's something that is covered by the author's institution. I will say that we recognize at this point that there are many institutions that are unable to cover these fees. And so one of the things that we've been doing is to create a sponsorship fund for authors who are at institutions that really can't cover that at this point. Which sort of takes me on to the library membership model. So the library membership model has been developed for libraries who wish to support Luminous. There is no requirement for any library to support the program, but libraries can join at different levels of sponsorship per year. We use the funds that libraries donate to help cover the cost of individual books, and then anything that's left over from that goes into this waiver fund to help support authors at institutions that are unable to help cover the costs. So we started publishing in September. We've published 11 titles so far. Many of those have just published over the last few months, so this is very sort of new data and in the very early days of publication for many of these books. We have been very pleased with the reception, and in particular, what we're seeing in the numbers here is that we've beaten all of our goals for the full financial year, which doesn't end until the end of June. We were fairly cautious about the number of print copies that we would sell, assuming that we may sell 75 to 100 on average. You can see that our average is actually more than double that just at this early point. And in fact, we have a number of books that have sold between 500 and 1,000 copies. So there's still a demand for a reasonably priced print edition, even though there are free digital editions available. We've received generous support from many different libraries, and that ranges from large research institutions to much smaller libraries like Swarthmore College, for example. But I think what we're most excited about is the reach that we've been able to generate. There's always been a debate about how closed the audience really is for this kind of scholarship, and I think what we see in the usage data in these very early days is that there is a much larger audience than the ones who are able to pay for it. So you can see our download numbers here are much higher than we would see for typical books, but I think this next slide really talks to some of the things that we're most excited about in terms of the usage data, where you see that, not surprisingly, the highest usage comes from the US, but there are countries where we're seeing some fairly significant usage: Mexico, Brazil, India, for example, that would simply not appear if we were looking at a paid model. So I just wanted to finish up by talking about some of the issues that we've run into, as it impacts evaluation and how I see the sort of future evolving for open access monographs. Beyond the issue of prestige, I think one of the issues that we've run into is something of a switch as we sort of move along this sort of continuum from print to digital. Over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, I think we've been at a point where we've had a primary print publication with digital ancillaries, and there's a way in which this model takes us the next step down that road to a primary digital model with a print ancillary. And that's particularly for the books that take advantage of the digital capabilities of our platform, and including multimedia and other sorts of rich content alongside traditional print content. That means that the digital has to become the version of record. And it's not merely that the dissemination of results requires more than print, but rather that we're moving into a time where new modes of rhetoric and argumentation outstrip the ability of print to capture them. And the second and related issue is about new modes of authorship. As we begin to move further away from print and towards the more collaborative nature of digital, there are questions about how we will evaluate the individual contributions of authors in that context. And then finally, is this issue of licensing. I touched on this at the beginning when I talked about the ways in which journals have allowed for reuse of content, and the license that's become standard for open access journal publication allows others not simply to distribute the work, but also to remix and to build on the original work as long as they credit the original author for the creation of the content. There are ways in which book authors and humanists and social scientists feel uncomfortable with the implications of that model. And so I think, we're still at a stage where everybody isn't ready to go there. But there are questions, I think, about the ways in which authors and perhaps those evaluating authors will respond to that, and think about the ways in which any subsequent works that are built on that original scholarship are taken into account as part of that process. So where do we go from here? Excited as we've been about the initial reception of Luminous, I think there's a lot of serious work still to be done. There remain a host of unanswered questions about the future of the monograph and the nature of the monograph itself. Who do we want it to be for? Is it for authors? Is it for readers? If it's for readers, what kind of readers should it be for? And there are also a lot of questions about the way in which the nature of digital scholarship is really changing what we consider to be publication itself. And while there are a lot of things to be said about those, I'm just going to conclude with a few thoughts on the future for open access monographs more specifically. And so I think this is a key one. One of the things that we've run into as we've been talking to many faculty and many different types of institution is that there's a way in which faculty across fields, and not just in the humanities, have really not been engaged with open access and what it means. I think there's a cultural challenge here, and really it's rooted in the entrenched value system whereby authors prefer prestigious venues of publication over open access, and they prefer those venues because those are the ones that are valued by the colleagues who are evaluating them. And so although we may want to see open access advance more quickly, human nature itself means that many authors are going to continue to publish in those prestigious venues until that changes. Beyond the issues around licensing that I mentioned just now, there are also some pretty substantial challenges for fields that use a lot of third-party material. In particular, at UC Press, we do a lot in art history, and it's been really challenging for us to think about how we can publish those books in digital form, let alone open access form, because the rights holders are either not prepared to give us the rights, or if they are, it's at a cost that is simply prohibitive. There are also issues around discoverability, as we've been finding out, making sure that this content can be found online, making sure that we can successfully get it into the library catalogues and discovery tools that everybody uses. And interestingly, I think one of the questions we really hadn't anticipated when we went into this was, how do we make sure that this content is discoverable to those who can perhaps most benefit from it, for example, in the Global South? Our marketing, we don't market to India, for example, because bluntly, nobody in India can afford to buy our content. But now we have content that's freely available that can really benefit scholars in those countries, and we have to think about how we can make sure that they're aware that it exists in a different way. There are also, I think, continuing technology challenges. If you look at all of the surveys, many faculty and students still are not comfortable with long-form reading online. And I think we still have some way to go to get the experience of reading online much closer to the experience of reading a print book, if it's to be a fully acceptable alternative. And then finally, there are the funding and business model challenges. The Luminous model, I think, has been a way for us to get started with the sources that are available to us at this point in time. I'm not sure that it really sort of scales across the entire system. If all university presses were to be coming to libraries with buckets and trying to work out how we do this, there are some interesting conversations underway at an institutional level involving both provosts and libraries and presses to try and address this in a more sort of sustainable and scalable way. But I think it really is going to require that kind of change and a much more significant commitment from all of those who are engaged in this if it's going to scale in the way that many of us would like to see it do so. So I think that, I hope that Luminous is making a contribution in helping us find more sustainable models. And I think importantly, one of the reasons why we wanted to get started publishing in the way that we have is that it's really important for us to be able to demonstrate that an open access monograph is not just as good as a traditional monograph, but there are many ways in which it is actually better than a traditional monograph. Thank you.
So for the third of our speakers, I'd like to introduce Tara McPherson, who's Associate Professor at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts and Director of the Sidney Harman Academy for Polymathic Study. Broadly, her research engages the cultural dimensions of media, including the intersection of gender, race, affect, and place. Recent scholarship focuses on the digital humanities, early software histories, feminism, and race, as well as upon the development of new tools and paradigms for digital publishing, learning, and authorship. She's author of the award-winning Reconstructing Dixie, Race, Gender, and Nostalgia in the Imagined South, co-editor of Hop on Pop, The Politics and Pleasures of Popular Culture, Transmedia Frictions, and several journal issues, and editor of Digital Youth, Innovation and the Unexpected. Her Feminist in a Software Lab is forthcoming from Harvard in the fall of this year. She's the founding editor of Vectors, a multimedia peer-reviewed journal, and a founding editor of the International Journal of Learning in Media. Her research has been supported by the Annenberg Center for Communication, the Ford, Mellon, and Rockefeller Foundations, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. When I was in graduate school, I was really excited when one of the most exciting scholars in digital work came to visit. It was Kate Hales came to speak, and what Kate Hales wanted to talk about for her entire talk was this cool new journal, Vectors. And so that's where I first ran into Tara's work, and it's worth hearing about. So please welcome Tara McPherson.
Thanks for that generous introduction, Brian. So I'm going to speak in a slightly different register as a faculty member who is interested in infrastructural questions, but is actually primarily interested in what digital media affords scholarly analysis and the directions we might take it. So I will talk a little bit about infrastructure, but I also primarily want to talk about work I've done with a core group of collaborators over about a dozen years to think about what scholarly publishing might be. So really to kind of occupy the space of the possible and the experimental, a little more than the practical from the outset. So the journal that Brian mentioned, Vectors, launched in 2005 as really a way to experiment with visual language, with database structures, with open access publishing, with new screen languages, and really to get, in complicated ways, at the relationship of form to content that Allison mentioned as a possibility for digital publishing. What new rhetorics, what new forms of argumentation argumentation, what forms of expression are possible with digital technology. And this is probably not entirely surprising given my location as a feminist media scholar in a school of cinematic arts, right? I come from a tradition in graduate school forward of being deeply interested in the friction between theory and practice, as many filmmakers have before me, right? So in Vectors, we were interested in publishing work that could not exist in print, work that explored the immersive capacities of film or video games for new registers of scholarly production, that pushed the humanities more toward the arts than toward the quantitative force of the scientific, as the digital humanities often does, and in really thinking about aesthetics and visual expression. So the Vectors projects, and I'll really quickly just show you screen grabs from a few, asked scholars to collaborate through a fellowship model with our design and programming team, where the scholars worked quite intently to produce the projects with the team, not to have someone build projects for them. This piece is by the feminist scholar Karen Kaplan, investigating military vision by representing ideas around both overhead views and what we would now understand to be drone views. Many of the scholars we chose to work with through the Vectors Fellowship model were scholars interested in issues of feminist theory, of post-structuralism, of social justice, of issues, you know, kind of near and dear to our hearts, right? So we weren't so much setting out to build a tool as we were setting out to think about the affordances of these platforms for very particular kinds of scholarship. A more recent project with the historian Emily Thompson from Princeton allowed Emily to locate on a historic map of Manhattan a vast archive of sound complaints from the 1920s and 30s that people wrote to a commission in Manhattan complaining about noise in their neighborhoods. The letters still exist. They're accessible through the interface. The interface splits the archive in a variety of ways. So you can investigate spatially, you could investigate by sound type, you could investigate by a timeline. A project that looks, none of these projects probably look like articles to you, right? But this project really doesn't look like an article. It was a project with Trevor Paglen, now a quite well-known media artist, but at the time we worked with Trevor, a grad student in critical geography at Berkeley, who came to us with a really odd tale about these planes that were operating in black zones, carting prisoners around the world, right? That we now understand to be the Janets and to be the black planes that are Rhodesian planes moving illegally prisoners through airspace. Because Trevor works with a bunch of really paranoid conspiracy theorists, he actually has the plane numbers for these planes for the Janets, and was able then, because they have to register with the FAA, even if we don't know what they really are, right, to track them. So we built with Trevor a tracker, which in real time for 2 years tracked the Janet planes, long before many of us knew that they existed. We fully expected to be arrested. We had a lawyer on call, and nobody really cared, right? So that was good. Another graduate student we worked with was Kim Kristen, who is now a professor in Washington, who was an anthropologist from the HISCON program at University of California, Santa Cruz, which, if you know the program, is not deeply practical, right? It's very theoretical and experimental. Kim was interested in ways that digital technology might not make everything open to all, but understand the kind of Western implications of imagining that we should have access to everything whenever we want it. She works with indigenous peoples in Australia and was intent on building a project which foregrounded for the Western reader the kind of colonial, imperialistic force of believing we should have access to everything all the time. So Kim used this project to animate archival materials and ethnographic materials from her dissertation, but also to foreground knowledge protocols that were non-Western in the very design of the digital interface. So all the projects are trying to marry argument to form. This is a project that collects hundreds of videos produced by soldiers in Afghanistan Afghanistan and Iraq, many of them quite disturbing, and recontextualizes them through a series of cultural rubrics in this kind of triptych format. Blood Sugar collects audio histories of hundreds of IV drug users in the Bay Area from a needle exchange program, and mobilizes through an experimental interface and a series of tags that archive in order to stage an emergent argument toward a deeper understanding of addiction as a cultural paradigm, right? So Sharon also worked with us on an award-winning project about incarceration, arguing for the abolition of the prison. All of the projects I've just quickly blown through are available for free online at Vectors. Vectors has been dormant for a while as we've built a project that I'll tell you about now, but we'll be launching a new issue in about 4 weeks with projects entirely built in Scalar, which I'll tell you about in a moment, including this piece that uses Scalar's API to build a very Vectorsy-like project. So Scalar is a technological platform, a web authoring platform, a content management system that allows scholars to build long-form digital scholarship without needing the design and programming team at Vectors, right? It's not quite templated, but it's close. But Scalar sits as a platform deep in the middle of a huge human infrastructure that's harder and more unwieldy and more challenging than a technological platform, right? It's meant to think about workflow across the scholarly process, from digital archival materials through research centers and scholarly fellowships through to relationships with presses at the other end. It takes lots of people. We have many archive partners, many university press partners. The original conversations that led to Scalar's development were deeply influenced by your colleague Wendy Chun, who's over here, who was one of the PIs on 2 grants that kicked off the work for Scalar. So many people have participated in the process. And Scalar really is meant to allow you to build scholarship that addresses many of the shortcomings of Vectors projects. So the Vectors projects were wicked fun. We really enjoyed building them. We learned an enormous amount from them. Much of what we learned is ported into the design of Scalar as a platform. And, but we also did some really boneheadedly stupid things with Vectors, right? So we didn't talk much to our librarians to begin with. We were working like a design lab, right? We worked in a program called Flash, which I would argue is probably still the best way to design an interactive digital project, but it's a project that will not last because Steve Jobs will not let it exist on this device, right? Well, he's dead now, so I shouldn't speak ill of him, right? But they're not, you know, they won't, Flash will not persist as a platform. It also doesn't allow you to crawl in it with the web. You know, it's got lots of limits. The Scalar process was expensive. They were, you know, each project was intricately handcrafted and built for the argument at hand, and you can't scale that in a broad way, right? So Scalar is meant to take some of those lessons from Vectors and scale them out to other forms of practice. So we've built it much more smartly. It will play forward relatively well across the landscapes of the web. It has an open API which lets you customize things. You could learn it fairly quickly and start to build simple things with very little support. So, you know, it's been carefully thought through. It also is interested in how archival digital material might exist in ethical contexts. So what we're building now is a middleware platform called Tensor. And all of those names are mathematical puns. As a scalar is a force which multiplies vectors, a tensor is something else, right? So they all fit together. And Tensor is sort of like an iTunes playlist for your digital content, which allows you to work across multiple archives to bring together material that you might then pull into Scalar or Omeka or other kinds of publishing platforms, while keeping the trail of origin of those materials very close at hand, right? So unlike Pinterest, where you might pin your stuff but then never be able to find the source again, both Scalar and these middleware platforms want your archival materials to exist in context. The media in Scalar projects doesn't exist there, and that makes publishing much easier because you're not dealing with rights in the same way. We're also interested in fair use. Fair use is scholars' ability to use materials in a variety of ways that your lawyers at your university will probably tell you that you can't. Fair use exists in use, so if we cede it, we don't get it back, right? Fair use is an important terrain for scholarly intervention. So Scalar now has about 15,000 users. It's used in a variety of contexts, from relationships to presses to things people publish on their own, to many pedagogical experiments. This is a project just forthcoming from a book by Matt Delmont about segregation in busing. His book is in print. This is a digital companion that extends into multimedia registers, the print book. Scalar has built-in visualizations that Matt didn't need to know how to program that help you understand the content in your project. This project by one of Brown's own, right, Jackie Wernemont and many others, uses Scalar to simultaneously create an archive of over 1,000 objects, and also to create pathways or chapters or slices through that archive. So this aggregates 8 separate collections that live in different places into one interface, and then asked a variety of scholars and activists to come together and build together narrative examples that use this material. So it's once an archive and an edited collection about the archive. The Hemispheric Institute and NYU and Duke Press have just launched 2 open access books through Scalar, and that will become a series edited by Diana Taylor. We've used the Scalar API to do a series of very experimental vectors-like projects, including this one which animates the audio text of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech, while also contextualizing our sanitized understanding of King to understand his more radical force. The FemTechNet Collective has used Scalar to build out its pedagogical materials in a variety of instances. And this is a project that we had nothing to do with that comes out of Penn from a freshman seminar, where 15 student scholars working together with primary archival materials over the course of the fall semester built a very robust project exploring the history of a ship's journey in 1864 through a variety of lenses and with a variety of interactive media. So these kinds of projects, I think, point the way to lots of changes that scholarship might undertake, despite the hurdles that we've heard well articulated by Allison. I think they also point the way to new forms of the dissertation that we could think about in lively ways. This is another of Brown's own. Samantha was an undergrad here who worked with John Cayley. She is a student in our interactive PhD program, and she is making media as part of her dissertation, not just writing about media. And I'd encourage you to buy this novel in the App Store. It will blow your mind. So here's some questions that motivate our work. I'll move through them really quickly. Is this really the best format for scholarship today in all fields, right? In some fields it probably is, right? In surgery, probably not, right? Because surgery is supposed to be helping to illustrate to you technique, right? And you could imagine, would you prefer your surgeon to read about the technique or have seen it? Raise your hand, right? See, right. So, I think there are fields where we really want to encourage inroads into the digital because the field demands it. Not because it's fun or sexy or clever, but because the scholarship and its purpose will be better served by the digital. I think, there are really important ways for us to think about the relationship of form to content as we move forward in scholarship. This was an early experiment with MIT Press that helped us design and build Scalar that explores YouTube through its own rhetorical gestures, right? So it's a book about YouTube written as if it were YouTube, and it exists only in a digital format. We're also very interested as we build out Tensor to think about how our relationships to archival objects as scholars might be richer and more bidirectional. So are any of you scholars who use primary archival materials? right? And you do important work with that material, right? And when the scholar after you comes to that material in the archive, they may never know about the work you've already done with it, right? So our relationship as scholars to the archive is vampiric. We suck out what we want, and we give very little back besides acknowledgments, right? And there are ways now that technology could help us have a more responsible relationship to the archive, where you can imagine your scholarly argument, your interpretation, your analysis, bits of it could be marked to flow back to the archive, right? So we're thinking about Tensor in that bidirectional way. You know, there are implications to our technology, right? They're not neutral. We know that as the government asked Apple to provide a backdoor to your iPhone, right? And I think as scholars, it would behoove us to think about what those implications are and to participate in the design and development of new ways of working, to think really richly about what we want to do as scholars, right? And this is a project that Kim Kristen, who slide I showed you from Vectors before, Digital Dynamics Across Culture. Kim went on after her Vectors Fellowship to lead the charge toward building new kinds of archival platforms that allow Indigenous peoples to manage their knowledge and cultural heritage in ways that fit their protocols, right? She's not a software designer, she doesn't write code, but she's a humanities scholar who understands the ideological, political, and ethical dimensions of the world that we're working in. And she's helping to design and build software that facilitates new ways for knowledge to circulate that respect Indigenous protocols. Finally, I think we should ask who our scholarly publishing systems actually serve, right? If you're a junior scholar, a grad student, you have very good reason right now to continue publishing wherever you can in traditional formats that are understood by your hiring and promotion committees. If you are a tenured scholar, if you are a full professor, I hope that you will never again publish with Routledge, Francis and Taylor, Elsevier, for-profit, I'm not kidding, for-profit presses that do not return benefit to the scholarly ecosystem, right? University presses are who you should be supporting, right? Who are trying to find new systems and new models to build. But those other systems are just, you know, taking our labor, monetizing it, and sending that money to, you know, Halliburton in the case of Francis and Taylor, right? So for scholars who pretend to be left and Marxist inclined, we don't respect at all the knowledge systems and the means of production that our labor circulates in. And it's time to stop doing that, right? And to operate in new ways. I think most scholars don't want to think too much about how our books are made after we send off our Word document and do our copy editing, right? We don't want to know about the, you know, library budgets and how they're being sucked up by Elsevier, the science publisher, who gives nothing back to us, right? They don't want to really think too hard about the pressures our scholarly societies are facing as we abandon them, right? But we ignore these systems and these tensions really to our peril as scholars who are committed to knowledge, right? And to the things that we care about in the archive and in our writing. If we care about the future of scholarly publishing, academics have an ethical responsibility to engage these systems and to really create new infrastructures that we're not so well skilled to create, but could help work toward for the creation, the circulation, and the preservation of our work. Thanks.
So as our panelists come to the front, we're going to move into the questions. We are recording this for posterity and possible inclusion in future, journals and things like that. And for that reason, when you ask a question, if you would please come to the microphone so that we can get your question recorded, and that way we can hear you instead of me repeating it into a microphone. And while I let you all think about your questions, I'm going to start with one that I have. One of the tensions that I think each of you are sort of speaking to is the fact that we had a regime in which one of the greatest scarcities on earth was publication. It was one of the hardest things to get. It was expensive. It depended on trees and a lot of labor. And then, as Kathleen pointed out, we suddenly have the internet, and publication is one of the easiest things in the world. And whether that's a good or not, perhaps remains to be seen. Now the challenge is attention, right? Attention is what is scarce. And to what degree do these new forms or platforms help draw more attention, and to what degree are they problematic for our attention? And Allison, you were sort of trending in this direction, talking about some of the improvements that need to be made to long-form reading technology. But how does this change in attention in this economy affect how we work with our scholarship?
Well, I mean, if I can start by talking about, sort of what we've been doing with what are still essentially book-shaped content, and then, I'm sure Tara can talk more about some of the issues with more truly multimedia and media-rich content. I mean, if you go and read the, survey after survey that comes out, whether it's students, undergraduates, high school students, faculty, there is still this strong preference for print in reading large chunks of long-form content, if I can sort of put it that way. What our survey suggests is that really what people want is both, because there are different use cases for both. There are times when the affordances of digital and being able to search easily and find references and find the specific content that you're looking for is clearly much easier in digital, but for actually sitting down and engaging in a more intensive and concentrated way, we still prefer print. There's a lot of interesting research coming out of neuroscience and psychology that sort of actually suggests reasons in terms of the way we read cognitively that print is easier for us. And I think it will take some time for that to evolve. And so I think, the ideal for books, at least, is really trying to provide both, although we are increasingly in a world where, as we see with our books and the really media-rich books, that we're moving away from an ability for print to really capture everything that the book, if you like, is about. We also need a better version than book for long-form content, because I use those two and neither is right.
And, books are wonderful things. I don't think any of us sitting in the front here would say to you, ban the book, right? Burn the book. We all read them, we all write them, right? They're, much safer in the bathtub than your iPad, right? There's real advantages to them. And some things should be in print books, right? Yeah. But there are many things that can't be in print books or don't need to be in print books. So I think Allison's exactly right. We need hybrid models, right? This, I think, should be a moment of fairly wild experimentation so we could figure out what could be sustained and what could last, right? And I think attention is that, attention means can mean very different things, right? So the prison project I briefly mentioned, Public Secrets, had been live less than 12 hours when a mother with an incarcerated son contacted us to think about the experience of that project on her, right, and how she could reach out to the people involved in it, right? That would not have happened with Sharon's scholarly article, probably even not in open access form. It was the design that changed, what the mother felt, right? So, accessibility, the mapping project I showed by Emily Thompson was covered pretty much around the Western world in media, right? So, there's attention and then there's attention, right? And I think if you calibrate the thing that you're making to the audience in its form, that intention's easier to sustain.
I would say, too, though, that part of what has become scarce is not just attention, but time and attention, right? That we're now in a situation in which the elimination of some of the scarcities around the production of publications has led to what feels like this incredible growth right now in terms of not just the amount of stuff that's out there, but the amount of stuff that we feel responsible for paying attention to, right? And so we find ourselves increasingly feeling like there's just too much. There's more than I know how to keep track of. And one of the beautiful parts of the old regime was that we knew where to focus our attention. The catalog came from the university press. We look through the catalog to find out what is in our field that we need to read. The journal shows up, we scan the table of contents. We know and we know that that stuff has been through a vetting process and has been declared by somebody, at least, to be worth the time that we're going to spend on it, at least for some value of worth. Right? We can be fairly well assured of that. With the internet, there's just this incredible overflow of stuff all the time, and some of it's worth paying all of that same attention to, and some of it's really, really not. And the shift that's happened, I think, and the most important shift in the age of the internet is the shift of that moment of the conferral of distinction, right, which used to happen at the moment of publication. This thing has come out in print, and therefore somebody has decided that it's worth my time. To instead now, that conferral of distinction happening combined with reception. That this thing is probably worth my time to read because somebody I trust has told me that they read it and I ought to read it too. And so the conferral of distinction and that decision about where to place our time and attention is happening in a much more networked way itself. Right? We know from the people that we follow on Twitter, who enough of them link to something, I'm going to go read it. The people that we pay attention to on Facebook, wherever it is that we are, right? That's where the recommendations come from. That's where we end up placing our time and attention. With a network like MLA Commons, I mean, we're really hoping to be able to capture some of that same energy and to say, hey, these are your peers. These are the people with whom you were working and with whom you were in conversation. And as they recommend things to you, as they upload things to you, you might have some of that same relationship with them. What we're finding, of course, is that, and this is not something that I was terribly surprised by, I had seen this in the first iteration with Media Commons, that scholars are themselves now facing what gets referred to as profile fatigue. Right? Yet another place where I have to create an account, I have to load up my profile, I have to keep it up, I have to, oh my God, I got promoted and I forgot to go update this thing over here and I have to go update that. So the division of time and attention continues at many levels. It's at reception, but it's also at participation. And thinking about how we can best make the networks that we are working with interoperable in order to make sure that the things that we're sharing and the things that other people are referring to us are as available and accessible and distributed as possible is one of our next goals.
I have ideas.
Cool.
I'll talk to you later.
Good.
Elias.
Hi, Elias Wahana in comparative literature. I have a question about why we, or whether it is useful to address the several important issues that you've addressed, or that we often talk about when we talk about the digital and the challenge to scholarly publishing. It seems to me that there are several different things going on, and they overlap in certain ways, but it's helpful, I think, sometimes to just focus on one at a time, because they're not all the same thing. There's questions of open access, or that's one thing. Mm-hmm. Issues of scholarly accreditation are another thing. Issues of changing opportunities and possibilities of form, the relationship between form and content is yet another thing. The question of there's probably 5 or 6 different themes that have come up in your discussions today, and I think it's sometimes unhelpful to say this is all the digital, and if we can solve the problem of the digital, then we will solve all these other things. Yep. When in fact, if some of the problems have nothing to do with the digital. Like the question of accreditation and publishing with a traditional press versus a digital press. That's, in certain ways, that's just I don't want to say ignorance, but it's just a lack of comfort on the part of accreditation boards or tenure boards. It's just not being familiar. If Harvard University Press decided today, we are no longer going to make books, we're only going to publish open access digital monographs, I don't think people would stopped giving tenure to scholars who published with Harvard University Press. I mean, they might sort of say, I would love to read this book as a print book, but I think it's a separate issue. It's not so much, you all understand what I'm saying, but that's just a general comment.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a series of problems that are almost like a Venn diagram. They touch upon each other, and if you push one, it might make the one over here wiggle, right?
Yeah.
But they're not the same thing, right? And I think that's part of the reason why a variety of different experiments right now at very different places is important, right? Because we could see if certain experiments in digital publishing help ease some of those pressures, right? So, you know, like the Model Stanford Press is, and almost all of these experiments are funded by Mellon, right? And like the Model Stanford Press is using is to explore form in relation to content and really to begin one-offs again, right? Which I find fascinating, right? You know, because, you know, I thought, you know, we weren't going to do that anymore, but I'm very happy they are, right? You know, and you know, that will help them understand certain friction points, right? And then beginning from the business model and moving out from that will probably scale better and help you understand other friction points, but maybe not be as sexy, right? So, I mean, I think it's important to have lots of different attempts right now and see what can thrive.
I'm actually going to pass on a question somebody asked me, and I wish she was here. So a young scholar got in contact with me and said, you know, I'm ready to publish. I have something that needs to be published. It needs to be published at least partially digitally. You know, she's thinking, this is something that can't just be in print. Where do I go? Where should I start? With all the different experiments going on, you know, what would you tell her?
I would, depending on what her field and the project is, she might go to Stanford, right? Because they have an editor now who for the next, you know, till the Mellon grant runs out, is charged with sourcing projects that need to be digital in some way, right? Mm-hmm. And helping to shepherd and facilitate those projects, right? So, you know, that's one option. We often run summer institutes. We don't have one this summer, where we matchmake folks with presses, right, to kind of imagine new forms of publishing. So, I mean, there are spaces, but more importantly, she probably needs to talk to her tenure and promotion committee if she's a junior scholar. And,
Good.
And get some clarity about expectations before the process goes too far, right?
I think that's extremely good advice. And I mean, there are a bunch of presses right now, as Allison was mentioning, this last round of Mellon grants that have gone around, a lot of presses that are doing a lot of experimentation, and some of which you can see the early results of that experimentation. So MIT Press has been doing a lot of experimentation around hybrid print digital projects. Minnesota has done a whole lot and is in the process of building a platform right now with the folks from CUNY who worked on debates in the digital humanities that are going to have some really interesting affordances. And, you know, you can find out more about what's going on with them. There are several others as
Michigan.
well. Michigan, obviously, yeah.
Quite a lot, yeah.
At the risk of complicating this discussion even more, I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about audience. So in my travels recently, I've been at a conference in Amherst on history communication, trying to work out how to more effectively communicate academic scholarship to other kinds of audiences. Just come from the National Council of Public History conference, which is all about audience. And it just really strikes me that when we're talking about digital publishing, we're often talking about opening this up, and we never really talk about audience. We never talk about the fact that there are real limits to who wants to read an academic article, however we deliver it. And some of this, I guess, even to put a more complicated spin on it, is a querying of some of those metrics. So I looked at the metric, you know, looking at those UC metrics. They remind me of the metrics that my institutional repository articles look like. And I know I really struggle to work out who in Poland wants to read about American history of sexuality. And I suspect that there are other things going on in our download metrics other than readership that also sometimes distract us from audiences. So I can sit there and think, my God, Eastern Europe loves me. But I really don't believe they do. Yeah. I don't, in fact, I probably shouldn't be thinking about what people in Eastern Europe are doing with my scholarship. So more broadly, this is, you know, publishing is one thing, But I think the other thing that often gets us into trouble there is a sense that if we publish, we get an audience. And obviously none of you believe that. But I just wonder how we manage to have those two conversations. That I think we often tell people, publish in one of these experimental formats and you will get a wider audience, where we all actually know unless you produce it differently. And to me, I'd be interested to know perhaps what Tara says about maybe how design cuts across what is usually for historians a question of how you write, and the fact that we don't generally write in a way that's intelligible to other people. But there's only perhaps so much publishing can do. So how do we bring this into conversation with what we know about the much more complicated world of online audiences, and even MLA, open forums is one thing, lots of people can read it, but what are they really going to make of it, and how much weight do we want to put on open as audience building versus really just open to the audience we've already got? So there's a whole mess. Choose what you want.
Well, I would just start by saying that I think I have a couple of responses which are not perfectly aligned to your question, which are kind of working at cross purposes to one another. My two responses. One of the responses is to say that I think a lot of times we scholars sell the potential public interest in our work short by suggesting that, I'm just writing for a small crew of academics anyway, no one's really interested in this. I watched the David Foster Wallace listserv for several years, and this was readers of Wallace from an incredibly wide variety of backgrounds, some academics, some not at all. Read every single academic article that was written not only about Wallace, but about anyone near Wallace, and about the philosophers that Wallace was reading, and they devoured this stuff because they really, really cared about the material. And they're an odd little niche. They're Wallace fans, right? But there is an audience out there for that kind of work, and I think that there's a broader audience for a whole lot of niche work that we don't necessarily recognize is there. We certainly won't find it if we keep the stuff locked up, right? So there is a potential for finding an audience that we're not yet aware of, whether it's in Poland or not. But on the other hand, I take your point very much that we've also got to be thinking about who it is we're talking to and how we're talking to them. I think we have a tendency to fall into the academic version of our inside voice, just naturally. We speak amongst ourselves, and therefore we speak a particular kind of language that is mutually intelligible and that works toward particular kinds of scholarly and political ends. And if we are able to modulate that voice a little bit and to speak with a voice that can reach out to a broader public, if we can do a little bit of code switching with the work, then we can actually build that audience that might have a potential interest. But it takes work to do that. It's not something that comes to us naturally.
And I think many of the vectors and scalar projects I show think about that, right? So the busing and segregation project I showed is a companion piece to a print book. And the print book is written for fellow historians, right? The scalar piece that kind of trailers the book, kind of showcases the book, is written for a broader audience. And Matt made the same choice with his book with UC Press on racial segregation in American Bandstand, right? So the digital extension of the book is written in a different voice, but translating the argument. The Vectors project that uses the letters from noise complaints in Manhattan is a really hefty academic book about sounds of the past that Emily Thompson's won a lot of awards for, including a MacArthur Genius Grant. But the Vectors piece is meant to animate that material for different audiences, right? So it got a lot more uptake than the book in NPR, right? So because it's mobilizing different. Huh? It does have the argument of the book built in it, in its kind of framing material, right? And not in the depth of the book, but it offers other pleasures, right? So thinking about, what pleasure your audience might want, right, is another thing.
Yeah, and I think just sort of two responses from me as well. I mean, in terms of the scholarly audience, I completely take your point about downloads. That's all the data we have at the moment, and raw downloads really don't tell you a great deal. We recognize that. Over time, I think there's going to be a lot more interesting work we can do with that. That said, there are, we have strong lists at UC Press, for example, in Latin American studies and in East Asian studies. So the fact that we're seeing high usage in those areas, I don't think necessarily means that people in those countries and regions aren't interested in the content that's being published. They just haven't been able to access it before. That said, I think we clearly need to be able to develop better metrics that tell us more about the true impact and engagement with the scholarship and get beyond raw downloads. And we're all still figuring out what that looks like. Citations in the old world, I think arguably doesn't tell you that much either. But, does the fact that an article has been tweeted frequently tell you anything either? Well, maybe, maybe not. But I think there are different ways, different things that different measures tell you. And so I think we're all sort of experimenting with some of the alt metrics and really trying to understand that more effectively. And then just the second point, I think, thinking about audience, again, digital affords more than print does in that way, because if you have a print book, it can only be written in one way. We have a couple of more experimental digital projects that we're working on that I didn't talk about today, but for one of them, we're really working on sort of creating different routes through the material by thinking about creating different user profiles. How would an undergraduate want to use this material? How would a scholar want to use this material? How might somebody who's approaching it more as a sort of public audience want to use this material? And so I think, there are affordances that we have with digital to be able to create those different profiles using the same content and the same material that we simply don't have in print.
Yeah, and the Warnemont project I showed you is interested in that, right? It has different voices, but the different authors engaging the archive that's there. I mean, we don't know what the download means, but I suspect almost all of you own a book or two you didn't really read, right? I mean, we didn't know what book sales meant either, right?
Yeah,
We still
don't.
Right.
Well, on the note of the different pleasures of reading and what our audiences might want, I'm going to suggest that we repair ourselves to the reception behind us and continue the conversation there. But please join me one more time in thanking our speakers.